Alright, now if you are thinking about doing this yourself to add a turbo to your non-turbo Subaru, there's some things you need to take into account. So you're going to need a turbo exhaust manifold. If it's stock cast iron, or if you get an aftermarket UEL header, either one of those work fine. If you do get an aftermarket UEL, I'm pretty sure that it will clear the NA water pump, so that is kind of a perk to doing a UEL. For me, I went stock because it's stronger. Yeah, it's heavier, but it's also cheaper. I picked it up for 50 bucks. If you can find a tubular header for about 50 bucks, I'd say do that. Otherwise, if you're doing this on the budget, you'll still get a Subaru Rumble out of the stock manifold. So that was my kind of line of thought in deciding to go with a stock cast iron manifold. Once you get your manifold, you need an uppipe. Now, if that's a rotated turbo, stock uppipe, if you're going to build it custom, you at least need the flanges. If you can find one cheap, and if you want to swap out the subframe, go ahead and swap it out for a WRX subframe or an early 90s Legacy turbo. That subframe will also work. I decided to just cut it because cutting the subframe took me maybe half an hour, and swapping out a subframe would be an all-day thing, and so time was a limiting factor for me, and so I just cut it. I'll be able to weld it to re-support it once I get the turbo on and everything settled. You also obviously need a turbo. I'll let you do your own research on what size turbo you want. I'm just using a TD04. They're really easy to come by. I picked mine up for $50. There's very minimal shaft play, and even if it does end up needing a rebuild kit for a TD04 is between $50 and $100, so pretty cheap. You're also going to need gaskets, normal exhaust manifold gaskets, exhaust manifold to downpipe gasket. I picked up a Grimspeed double thick for like $23 on eBay. Lots of people have issues with that gasket going bad if you ever have to take it apart, and so I got the double thick just to ensure quality. I picked up a Felpro turbo gasket kit off Amazon for I think $27. It had new exhaust manifold gaskets, uppipe to turbo gasket, and turbo to downpipe gasket. So it had all of those for $27. It's Felpro. I trust Felpro. I like Felpro gaskets. They're reasonably priced and they're pretty good quality. So I got those. You also need a downpipe. If it's in the stock location, stock downpipe works fine. You can pick up a catless downpipe on eBay for like $100. You can find them used all over the place on your local classifieds for relatively cheap. You can go for an expensive Cobb or Perrin or whatever aftermarket cat. I'm just running a stock downpipe because it is I think it's a 2.5 inch, it might be 2.25 inch downpipe, which is big enough for the power I'm making. I'm keeping the cats. Yeah, they are going to be a restriction. Right now I don't need cats because I don't need to pass emissions, but I still kind of appreciate the job that cats do of filtering out some of those worst gases. Helps the environment. You really don't lose that much power. I would recommend doing high flow cats. You'll pass emissions still, and you'll still filter out some of the bad gases that we don't need. So once you have your downpipe figured out, you're going to need to get a charge pipe. So if that is the stock Y pipe that comes off the top mount intercooler, that's fine. If you want to run a front mount intercooler, you're going to need piping. The charge pipe from the outlet to the intercooler, and then from the other side of the intercooler into the intake manifold with all their couplers and everything like that. I'm choosing to go without an intercooler right now because the stock intercooler does not fit, and I'm only going to be running right now 4 psi, and really you don't really need a intercooler with 4 psi, so it's not going to make that much of a difference power wise. In the future I might put on an intercooler or something, but right now I'm just running a straight charge pipe from the turbo to the intake manifold. You're also going to need to plumb the turbo. So I picked up stainless steel braided oil feed line on eBay. I think I paid about $30 for it. It came with all the fittings I needed. It'll plug straight into the top of the engine. The stock oil pressure sensor sits right there. The oil line kit came with the fittings to be able to tee that sensor back in and then run a oil line up into my feed. I have the stock water lines, the metal ones, that I'm going to attach and just tee them into any water fitting. In my case, because I've rotated the front housing and because I blew my stock wastegate, I'm going to run an external wastegate. If you're not going to rotate the front of the turbo, I'd just recommend you running your stock wastegate. It's probably the cheapest option. However, to drop PSI, I was only wanting to run 6 PSI, and my stock wastegate, I'm pretty sure, was a 10 PSI wastegate, and so that's why I tried to limit it and decrease that boost pressure. Ended up failing because it got too hot and I popped the diaphragm in there. Anyway, to buy a new one that would be a 6 PSI wastegate off of an 03 to 05 Forester XT, I could only find them for about $45 to $50, and I figured an external wastegate is only $55. Yeah, this is a really cheap Chinese one, but I figure it'll do the job, and with these ones you can buy adjustment springs to the exact PSI you want. This one is a 4 PSI spring. You can always throw on a manual boost controller or an electric boost controller and adjust the boost up from 4 PSI. So I just got the 4 PSI one. And for right now, until I figure out how it runs, a 4 PSI boost is going to be great. Now, talking about boost, the best thing that you could do is go aftermarket, an AEM module, a piggyback module, something to that effect for engine management. On the 90s Subarus, you can get away with no management at low PSI. The stock MAF can deal with that amount of airflow and pump in the amount of gas it needs so you don't detonate. I upgraded my fuel pump to a Walbro 255. I have stock injectors, but I figured my boost isn't going to be any higher than I need for the stock injectors, but I did want to make sure I had enough pressure behind those stock injectors to be able to push that fuel that I need, because I am running boost. I don't know if it's really that necessary. You could even just use a WRX or STI fuel pump, but I found a used Walbro for $50 on my local classifieds, and that was the same price they were asking for WRX and STI pumps. So a Walbro 255 new on Amazon is only $80, and so, I mean, lots of people are asking more than that for a stock WRX fuel pump in my area. Obviously, it should only be like a $30 part, but anyway, I'm not totally positive if you actually need an upgraded fuel pump, but I did it just to be safe. It's not necessary, but it's kind of a good idiot light to install a boost gauge, and I'm going to be running a narrowband O2 sensor gauge. Doesn't really do much. A wideband would be better, but I picked up my narrowband gauge for $12 on eBay. Obviously, a wideband O2 sensor and gauge is going to be over $100. That is the goal in the long run, but for now I'm just trying to see if this will work for the minimum that I can pay and still make a little bit of boost. I'm not looking for a ton of power, mostly just looking to have an extra bit of fun. The way I'm doing mine, my inlet pipe is going to be totally custom. If you're wanting to run the turbo in the stock location, you have to worry about a couple of things. So on a turbo car, the turbo sits down in here, and the inlet comes up through here underneath the intake manifold, off underneath these arms. The turbo cars have a remote mounted power steering reservoir that's mounted kind of over here. And so on an NA car, unless you want to change all that, you're not going to be able to get that inlet through here. And so what some guys have done, you can just get a 90-degree coupler to just pop this up. When it's sitting down there, it'll just pop it up here, and then you can run your inlet pipe up here. Obviously mine's going to be custom, and so mine's just going to come off right off here. The first thing I would do if you're wanting to turbo your NA Subaru is to buy a turbo and just kind of shove it down in here, because I didn't do that, and I was just expecting things to fit, and I didn't realize this AC line was sticking out so far, which really hindered my ability to put this turbo in the stock location. It wouldn't fit right there, and so I was thinking, since I don't have axles, because it's rear-wheel drive, I was going to mount it lower, but that's not fun. I was trying to figure out where to mount it one day and actually had the turbo here in the engine bay. I had a couple friends over. One of them said, well, why don't you just see if you can get an aftermarket AC hose made so it comes just off this way, or have it come over and up and around the engine bay to connect. Anyway, to make this just more low profile, and that's a pretty good idea, and it could easily be done just taking the measurements you want to a hydraulic shop, and they'll make you a high pressure line. I didn't want to pay for that, and I have the fab skills to be able to do whatever I want to mount the turbo, and my wife just said, well, why don't you just stick it up higher and mount it through the hood? And I was thinking about that, but until someone else said it, I thought it sounded pretty ridiculous. But when my wife said it, that's when you know it's a good idea. So turbo is gonna stick through the hood just a bit. You can see it'll pop up real just nicely. I was going to run this, which would make it stick up a lot higher, and now I'm not running it, and I'm kind of happy about that because I think it's kind of ugly, and it'll be cool. My local laws allow me to just run my dump pipe from the external wastegate. I can just vent it wherever I want. It doesn't have to go through the stock downpipe, and so I'm just going to vent this up through the hood. So when I get on boost, this should sound pretty rad. There are a whole bunch of other considerations you need to take into account if you're planning on doing this. Spend some time on the forums, do your research. Almost every question has been asked. You have to weed through a ton of information to find good information, but it's worth it. Do your research so you know what you're doing. I've had a bunch of people ask me specific questions relating to their year and make about the manual swap, and I'm not an expert in 2000 and up Subarus. I know the 90s Subarus really well, and I'm an expert on the second generation phase 1 legacies. I'm an expert with the wiring and stuff on that. Besides that, I'm not an expert because I didn't do the research to become an expert on a different body style car. And so I've had some people ask me questions about manual swap, and I honestly don't know the answers, and I'm not going to spend the time to research it because I don't own that car. So do your own research, make the decisions you want to, and be willing to pay the consequences. I realize that this is a 2.5D. It has a high compression ratio. It's really peppy. It's great to drive NA. I want a little bit more power, and I realize that if I put too much power into it, I will get detonation because of the compression ratio and adding boost to that. Generally, you want a lower compression ratio when you're going to boost. So I do realize that, and I'm ready to pay the consequences of blowing up my motor, but I think it's worth the shot to see if we can do a low boost setup on the 2.5D to get a little bit more power out of it. Some people would argue that turboing the 2.5D at only 4 psi is not worth it. All the research I've done, I found that every psi you push into the engine, you get about 5 to 15 horse. Only running 4 psi, that's going to be around 40 horse increase, about. And for me, that's a totally fine. It's going to give me just that extra little kick of power that I'm looking for, while still being pretty safe, I think. There have been people that run low boost on the 2.5D and have done it for years and hundreds of thousands of miles and not had issues. And so I want to be one of those people. I've had a lot of people criticize me saying I'm just going to blow up the engine, but they've never done it. So let's see. I might end up blowing it, but if that happens, I can put in an H6 or put in an STI 257. Either way, I'm fine with that. Now, with that caveat on research being said, I understand the difficulty in finding good information online. And so really, if you do have questions, just drop it in the comments. I'll do my best to answer it. But at the same time, don't use my video as your only resource for figuring out how to turbo your non-turbo car. There are tons of resources available. This should just be one of your supplements. And hopefully, for those of you who have done the research and are still kind of sketched out about it, seeing somebody else do it should give you the bump to do it yourself. And that's what I'm all about. Alright.